Want to see me do it again? Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Premium Dimension Police deck profile. I think this has been a long-awaited one for quite a few of you, and I think it's also been a little bit of a while since the last Premium Dimension Police deck profile that I did as well. So today, we're going to be taking a look at a very in-depth look at the updated list after Premium Collection, and also, right off the bat, I want to give a big shout-out to Derek Dow, because he is the person that helped me craft this deck build. He currently does actual professional coaching on MetaFight for Vanguard, so if you want to book coaching sessions with him, you can do that. This is not sponsored, by the way. I'm just literally putting that out there because I actually got coaching from Derek before the Springfest that I went to in Antwerp way back in April, and so this whole deck was actually crafted with him together, and so if it wasn't for his help, I honestly don't think this build would be anywhere near as good as it is. So in today's deck profile, we're going to go over the main deck, we're going to go over the G-Zone, we're going to go over some of those kind of choices, and then I'm going to talk matchups in terms of what is actually popular in the current meta and how you can play around them. I've been playing this deck day in, day out, and especially here in Japan, there's a very big variety of players and what they play, so I've been really, like, ever since moving here, I've been facing less against, like, Redora and Nightmare Dolls, although still play against Redora sometimes, and a lot more diversity, like, a lot more, like, Vanquishers and, like, Hanzos, and all kinds of Bermuda builds, and, like, Eugene, and, like, all other kinds of things. So I've got a lot of things to talk about, but I'll be covering sort of, like, the more meta-relevant matchups. So I'm really excited to get into it, because honestly, this is a deck that I really, really love, and, like, it just feels like the most perfect deck that's ever existed for me in Vanguard. Like, I get so much thrill out of playing it, and like I could feel like I could play it for the rest of my life. Like, that's how good just it feels to play, and I think if you're a Dimensional Police man, you know what I mean. So we're gonna put aside these strides for now and go over the main deck, and of course we can't go over the main deck without going over the number one key card, which is Dialiner. So for the effect, I'll be popping up the English card text to make it easier for everyone to follow and you know what the cards do. So Dialiner, of course, we've taken a look at this card many times by now, but in case you do need a reminder, he gives plus 10k shield to all of your grade 3s, so that's already a very nice buff, and once per turn on Vanguard Circle, you can count +1 and soul +1, look at the top 7 cards of your deck, and add a normal unit from among them to your hand, and if that was a grade 3 that you added, it gets plus 20k and a crit. This has been the backbone of Premium Dimension Police since this card came out, in my opinion. Like, just being able to have a beefy defense is really good, and especially since Geomagas came out, it only got better, and with the new G-Guard in this Premium Collection, it's even better now, so it's just, you know, stonks forever. And the Axe skill is actually very big in Premium too, because you have some decks in the meta that can afford to not ride up and not go to grade 3 first, and therefore they will, you know, not let you get the first stride. Whereas with DP, you ride into this and you always, and I literally mean always, take Force 2. Because with Force 2, you are always going to have the nice crit pressure from things like Excalibur standing, from Geomaglas hitting for like 4 or 5 damage in one attack, from Unibird also hitting for 3 crit instead of just 2. And so you can ride up and take Force 2 and use the skill to swing with 3 crit. Now with this deck, one of the really important things that Derek taught me is damage mapping. Damage mapping is essentially the idea of pushing your opponent to a certain level where you know that you are only giving them X amount of damage to do their plays, and you're also putting them on a certain amount of damage that you can actually finish them off the next turn. For DP, that's basically 3 damage, and you have to always think, like, how much do I have to commit this turn? Like, how many other attackers do I need to commit on grade 2 or on my, you know, going first grade 3 turn to get my opponent to 3 damage so I can actually threaten to kill them next turn. You can also stop at 2 sometimes because you have things like Geomaglas that you can just swing, they guard it, and you pass, and you just don't give them CB. Because if you give, like, more than 2 CB to a Nightmare Doll player at some stage of the game, they're just going to dust you with Alice and you're going to die. Or, you know, like, in general, you have to always be very much aware of what you're doing. But with this, you can ride up and swing. And so let's say you swing and they PG it, and they're stuck at, like, 1 or, like, 2 or whatever. Like, that's fine because now we can go into Geomaglas. The other case is that you swing with 3 crit, and they're going to heal guard it, reducing it to 1 crit. But they're probably already at 1 or 2 damage, so you actually don't mind that because you push them to 3 anyway. So that threat is like, because they either have to guard it or like spend their heal guard, which is one of their precious G guards, because a lot of clans got really good G guards that have PG effects this meta. But if you force out a heal guard early, that's 1 less G guard they can use, which is also very important. So riding up with Dialiner is actually very good, and that's, I think, a part of the card that I didn't highlight as much before and was mostly focusing on the shield aspect of it. So Dieliner is going to be the backbone of the deck literally forever. Like, that's just it. I don't know how this could ever change. Moving forward, the other card that just feels like such an auto include that I think will always be in this deck forever is Dizoris. Now Dizoris, you don't ever really ride him except for like the Gridora matchup when you don't have extra Dieliners in hand to rewrite after they use the Gridora stride. But he does have a Vanguard Circle skill where during your turn he gets plus 5k for every damage you have, but we mainly use him for the Rearguard Circle skill, which is at the end of the battle you attack on Rearguard Circle. If your Vanguard is 35k or greater, you can combo +1, put into Soul, and then give your Vanguard plus 10k +1 drive. So keep in mind, because we're Force 2 deck, we actually don't reach 35k that often. On X-Gallop, you always reach it on GB3, and then of course on Unibird, you also reach it as long as you have like 1 damage. So in that sense, it's not that hard, but on the Geomagla's first stride, we typically don't reach 35 unless we used a die arm or something to give that extra pump. So because of that, you basically want to keep in mind that this skill will be going off and it's going to be very good, but be careful with the power. Now, of course, the value of this skill is that it gives an extra drive to X-Gallop and Stark, which are restanding Vanguards, and the drive is for the turn, so they will attack with the extra drive for all battles that they have. So in X-Gallop's case, this is 5 or 6 drives that reduce to either, 1 or 2 for the second attack, and in case of Stark, this is like 2-2-2, 3-3-3, depending on how many Dizoris you use. Keep in mind that this does cost a CB, and this deck does use a lot of Counterblast, and therefore you are going to run out of it if you're not careful with how you spend your resources. But generally speaking, especially with the addition of Unibird Galaxy, as long as we have 1 CB, or even if we don't have any CB, we can still do a lot with it. So Dizoris is a really good card, but I've explained it many times. And generally speaking, you also don't really need to see it in your opening hand. This is a card, like, if you have all the other Great 3s already in your hand, you can choose to search it out with your Tourney Chaser, which is a card that we're going to run, or talk about later rather. We do run it, but it's a card that is really good on like second stride. So on first stride, we typically don't really need it, and we sometimes just find it from the Geomaglas as well. And then I already spoke about him, but in my opinion, one of the most important cards in this meta, where a lot of decks are just farming up huge hands, which is Die Arm. Die Arm says, when placed on Vanguard or Rearguard Circle, if your opponent has 10 or more cards in hand, for that turn, 3 of your front row units get plus 30,000 power. So this means that even on first stride, you can put this down, and if your opponent, accidentally overdrew, like, because people usually know this card exists, and they will play around it, and then keep their hand at 9. At least here in Japan, people definitely do that. Like, they try to stay there, keep their hand at 9, and then they check that draw trigger that puts them to 10, and they're like, did not want to see that. But of course, this card means that for X-Gallop, the power threshold is 80k, and sometimes you can first stride X-Gallop if you have Die Arm in hand, your opponent has a big hand, because you'll have a 28k Vanguard, this pushes it to 58. You use 2 Dizorises, you go to 78, and then any form of a boost pushes it to 80, so you can first stride restand with like, 6 drives or whatever. And of course, huge power, and every time you place this card, you can activate the effect. So basically, you can call 2 of these, give plus 60k to your front row, so your Dizorises will also get buffed. And with the new G-Guard, you can recycle it back to hand for next turns in case your opponent still has a big hand for whatever reason if you didn't just win that turn. So Die Arm, in my opinion, like, I always go between 3 and 4 copies of this card because it depends on your meta, I think. There are decks, in my opinion, like Vank, especially, like Vank on first stride, especially if you're careful, doesn't really have that big of a hand. Eradicators can definitely beef up their hand quite a bit, but then there's things like Nightmare Dolls. I think Nightmare Dolls can definitely buff up their hand a lot. Gridora draws a lot, Luard draws a lot. Although Luard also depends on how much they farmed on the first Morfessa turn, because some Luard players will really commit everything just to get to Ritual 10. And then some people are just going to grade 2 game for a little bit to kind of like prolong that process. But then if you ride up, usually they stop grade 2 gaming and then they have to like, commit everything to Morfessa. So you can really shuffle this between 3 and 4 copies. And I will tell you what other card you can run at 4, which I'm currently putting down to 3. So yes, Die Arm is very good and honestly just an amazing card. And the fact you can get him back with the G-Guard is very important. Now the card that I run again, this is the other 3 to 4, depending on what the meta is. But if you're playing in the English meta where Nightmare Dolls are running rampant, I think you should play 4 and put Die Arm to 3. But here in Japan, where people play whatever they want, this card does come up a bit less because I don't play against Nightmare Dolls as much, and this tech was honestly made for Nightmare Dolls. And that is the Taser Large, Luge, whatever her name is. She's large in Japanese at least. So, what does this Brankgate card do, in case you don't know? Well, she says in the front row rearguard circle, so she has to be there. Once per turn, when your opponent's rearguard is placed not from hand, so from anywhere other than hand, you can rest that unit. This card is the counter to Nightmare Dolls, in my opinion, because we basically came across this interesting, cool interaction with Derek, is that you can basically make Nightmare Dolls, like the only way that Nightmare Dolls get rid of this, and Honley by an extent, is by going into their Nightmare Doll stride and using the Chelsea to, like, you know, put it into the soul. But in order to do that, they need to go into the battle phase, and otherwise they can try to attack into her, which also requires them to go into the battle phase. So what happens when they go into the battle phase and try attacking her is you G-guard Dismal onto her, and then she cannot be hit or retired or affected for the rest of the turn. So when your Nightmare Doll opponent tries to use Alice, you can basically go like, oh, you called the Alice from Soul, well that's not from hand, please rest it. Against Grand Blue as well, you can rest the Skull Dragons. Keep in mind that usually they're gonna commit the extra Counterblast to use the Skeleton Cannoneer to kill it, and they will do that before the battle phase, so Grand Blue can get rid of her. But keep in mind that there's an important timing where Cannoneer will try to kill her, and her effect will still go on standby, and therefore you get to resolve the effect to rest something, which can be that Cannoneer, which they'll probably pop for Jessie after that. But don't forget to still resolve her before she gets retired, because that's a very important thing. But by the time you get to the battle phase, as long as you have a heal in hand to go into a Dismal, you can protect her. So in English meta, if you see a lot of, you know, just Nightmare Dolls, please use her. Against Gridor, she's also a useful card because they will have to attack into her. And keep in mind that Geomaglas buffs your rear guards, not just your Guardians, but the attack power of them by 5k for each face-up one as well. And that's also during your opponent's turn. So if you have 3 Geomaglases face-up, she'll be at 28k in your opponent's turn. So Gridora, when she attacks and calls like Intrude Scissors and stuff like that, you can actually rest it as well. So in this meta, I think that Taser is just really, really good. But again, here in Japan, I'm playing against some pretty random things, and not everyone has superior calling, or they only call from hand, and therefore it's not as huge. But still, I really recommend playing this card. So again, in English meta, I would play 4 and put Diarm down to 3, but then here in Japan, where people play more random things, I am playing 3. And honestly, it is like one of the most important cards in this whole deck. So that's the grade 3s, that is all I run for grade 3s, so basically, you know, it's a pretty lean package. We don't have like surprising one-ups, which you can actually run, by the way. For grade 2s, we are running 4 copies of Die Dumper. This has become a staple in my opinion. So Die Dumper has 2 skills, the first one of which says all of your grade 3s get plus 10k shield, just like Dialiner. It's only on Vanguard Circle though, so you do have to ride this to get that effect off. But in my opinion, like, your hand does clog up with grade 3 sometimes, so like, especially against aggro decks, this is actually quite important. And like, I think people now know that to beat DP, aggro is a pretty good solution. The only thing is that, you know, if you run this at 4, you can also fight aggro pretty well. And then his other skills on Reverse Circle, when he attacks, you can give him plus 10k, and if you did, he retires and at the end of the battle. So that's basically it. So you don't use the Reverse Circle effect as much. I think you basically just want to ride this card, and then after that, you basically just guard with it, because there will be times where you need to guard with just 5k and 30k with your grade 3s. But he's your optimal ride target, and one of the 2 grade 2s that we play. Because yes, we only run 8 grade 2s in this deck, and I embrace it, and I think you should embrace it too. The other one being, of course, the other one of the best cards in the clan, which is Gelfludge. Gelfludge is a funny little fella. He says when you ride or call him, if your opponent's Vanguard is grade 3 or greater, grade 2 or greater, sorry, you soul blast 1 and choose one of the following. But if it's grade 3 or greater, then you do both of the effects. So one of the effects that you can make your opponent do is they may Counterblast 1, and if they don't, you draw 1. And the second one is your opponent may Soul Blast 1. If they don't, their Vanguard loses 5k power for the turn. So in this meta, Nightmare Dolls will always give you the draw, because Nightmare Dolls don't want to use their CB, because every CB equals an Alice, or it means Dust, or it means X and Y, right? Gridora also typically will give you a CB because they need to use it for Gridora, because they're afraid of getting damage denied. Yes, Gridora does have quite a lot of counter charge, but if they don't have it in hand, then typically they're going to give you this. So the draw skill is really, really good. Like, you can play this in the early game and like even rush with it against the things like, again, we have Protect and Axel decks in the meta, so 9k actually hits them pretty nicely on Rearguard Circle. Riding it is fine, but typically speaking, you want to ride Die Dumper if possible. But as, like, you know, our 8 5k shields in the whole deck, this is the smallest shield we're running, and it's also a very useful one because it usually converts into a bigger shield from the card draw. And like, even if you don't get the draw, forcing your opponent to Counterblast is usually very, very good. But of course, usually the decks that are giving you the Counterblast are the ones that can afford to. So keep that in mind, you know, don't pop off just because you made your opponent CB. Pop off that, you know, you got the draw usually. Usually you're getting the draw. Now for the grade 1s. I guess I won't start with a tech, sorry, I had this laid out in a different order. I'll start with the most staple cards of all, and like literally the card in my opinion that saved the freaking clan. Not that it really needed saving, I'm obviously exaggerating here. But this is my favorite grade 1, and honestly one of the best cards in the deck. I feel like I say that about almost every card in the deck, which is Eternity Chaser. Eternity Chaser has 2 skills, one of them being insane and the other one being really good. The first skill is the insane one, which says when you ride over this card, you can discard 1 card and then reveal a grade 3 normal unit from your hand. And if you did, you search your deck for a different named grade 3 from the one revealed and add it to your hand and shuffle your deck. The second skill is back row rearguard circle. When your opponent's rearguard attacks, if its power is 25k or lower, you can Soul Blast 1 and retire this unit, and then choose one of your units, and it cannot be hit for that battle. So this card, so the first effect is really huge because the way it works, you have to reveal a normal unit. So you have to reveal either your Dialiner, Dizoris, the Taser, or the Diarm. So you reveal one of those. And so if you don't have Dialiner, you will always search that because that is your main grade 3 ride that you always want to have. And then your second in priority is, against many matchups, going to be the Taser, because Taser is, like, this doesn't specify Dimension Police cards. You can search for any grade 3 that is a normal, like, any grade 3 can be searched, not just normal units. So your second priority is either Taser or your Heal Guard, because this searches heals. It says reveal a normal unit, but the search target is any grade 3, so you can search out your Heal Guard and then you have a G Guard for the actual turn that you can G Guard. And especially if you have like a Taser in hand, you need to search the G Guard because that will give you the Dismal to protect it. Otherwise, if you already have both of those in hand, your next priority is probably Diarm against most matchups, because especially if you're playing against something that will farm hand, because you can usually tell by their grade 1 ride, because this only goes off on your grade 2 ride, so you can usually read into the matchup by then. And aside from that, then Dizoris I think is like the final priority, because you only really use Dizoris in second stride, and I usually let Geomaglas find it for me. But the second skill is really good in this upcoming meta because Mega Colony got a card that, when flipped, it can use its skill to essentially make your opponent's Vanguard lose 10k power. But Mega Colony's rearguards are still fairly low power, and they usually hit for the 25k and under. So even though your Vanguard is at 3k power, you can still proc this to basically sacrifice a 10k shield from the board in a Soul Blast in order to make one of their rearguards not hit. So this is really good, and also against Alice too. Alice, obviously on an Axel, is hitting for 27, so that's going to get over it. But if they hit for like a 24, sorry, I mean I say 27 because assuming... Actually no, I guess Leslie is usually the call target from Yvette, or from Dark Lord rather, so... Or no, it's Yvette that calls it. So, you know, because that's a 7, so it's a 12, so 22. But anyway, like, against Nightmare Dolls, you can use this to also block some of the hits. So it's really, really nice in the back row too, and it's an 8k booster, which hits, you know, when you have a 28k X Gallop, this will push to 36, and then you just need another, 50k power from any other source, including the GB3, to push it up to that. Then the next best grade 1 is Commander Laurel. We're running 3 copies because, again, this is a card that is fairly situational. On first try, this can be really good if you want to go into an immediate X Gallop if you got a lot of CB from your opponent. Alternatively, the extra crit can be what seals the deal. So I did mention, like, damage mapping at 3, and part of the reason is because Excalibur 4 is going to be swinging for 2 crit, but if you want to buff it up and give it the 3rd crit, the Laurel will do it for you. You don't really use it on your first stride turns unless you're going into Excalibur on first stride, and with Unibird you don't really need this card either. So specifically for like Stark and Excalibur that you're doing that, like the double power, double crit kind of play. But it can be very useful, especially because we're running Linkas, which we can put into Soul. We can rest them first for this cost and then put them to the Soul and free up those circles. In Japan, there's quite a few people that run the one of old Laurel, because now with Unibird Galaxy, it's actually fairly good because you can swing first with Unibird because you don't need to actually attack with your Dizorises because you don't need the extra drive that much. So you attack with a Unibird, and then if they take it, you can use Laurel to rest 4 rearguards and just like swing again. And if you check your stands, then that's even better. But I personally don't run it at the moment because I am dedicating much more deck space to just counter things. So like there's builds that are like, they don't run like Tasers, they don't run the next card I'm playing, which is Honolly. And as a result, they play more like, I guess like kind of, I want to almost call them win more cards. But for me, like this deck is built to fight the meta, and it's gonna fight the meta, it's gonna beat the meta. That's literally was the whole point of this deck. So I hope that you are also seeing where I'm coming from here. And, I already spoiled it, but the final card is Honolly. So Light Elemental Honolly. 3 copies, because 3 copies is just enough. Against some matchups, you do not need it. So I think I didn't read out Laurel's effect earlier, but of course, once per turn, Kamas 1, rest 4 rearguards, and then choose a unit and double its power, give it a crit. Sorry, I think I might have put up the blurb, but just in case. So Honolly's effect, in case you don't know it, first things first, it's a Cray Elemental, can be played in any clan. And then when this unit is placed on rearguard circle, you choose a card, a face-up card in your damage zone, and turn it face down. So if you don't have any face-up and you call this, then you don't turn anything face down. Like, you can still call it, even if you can't pay the cost there. And then the most important skill is all rearguards, both yours and your opponent's, unless Canobus 1 is paid, cannot attack for a 5th or more battle to the opponent's Vanguard this turn. So this is again a tutor. Or not a tutor, this is a counter card for Nightmare Dolls, because Nightmare Dolls, of course, will do their Alice, Leslie shenanigans, and you want to stop that. So against Nightmare Dolls, again, it's the same thing where they can go into the Nightmare Doll to like try to get rid of it, but you run Dismal so you can protect it. But usually speaking, like they will just plan their attacks, like good Nightmare Doll players plan their attacks to not be affected by this card as much. But generally speaking, like this makes a lot of decks fold. Like there's been a lot of Victors popping up lately too. This is really good against Victor because you can just call 2 copies of it, and then the like PogChamp Victor cannot get rid of it anymore. So Honolulu is just a really good card for Dimension Police because you need a way to beat the decks that are aggressing you like crazy. Against Tachikaze, it can also be really good, although Tachikaze does have removal options, and Tachikaze is definitely going to be on the rise. Like that deck is very good in Premium after the both the new Premium Collection and after Spino Reverse. Spino Reverse is insane. Like I played in the locals last week, or no, this week, and like we sadly both lost because we timed out. Like the game went on for so long that like we both lost the time. But like that deck is scary. Like it honestly, if you don't have Honolulu, like they can do a lot. So like you have to kind of like damage choke them so they don't have like the removal for it. So yeah, Honolulu is a very big recommended card. It wins you, in my opinion, the Nightmare Doll matchup, and it greatly affects things like Luard, because of course, Dagda shenanigans can only go on for so long. I'm trying to think what else has been coming up against. Of course, Grand Blue. Grand Blue will also waste their CB to get rid of this, because then otherwise they cannot do their like Night Storm, Beatrice, Skull Dragon combos. So it's huge against the Grand Blue matchup as well, which is a very strong deck going into this meta. And there's just a lot. So Honolulu, I think, even if you don't play Dimension Police, I would recommend running Honolulu. Like, it's a very important card. So if you have Honolulu's, they've been reprinted, you should pick them up. Then we get into the trigger lineup. Trigger lineup, we have the OT. Of course, the OT is very good. This randomly wins you games. It doubles your Vanguard's power and, it doubles the power and crit of all of your front row. So of course, in X Gallop, this is, you know, potentially just swinging for like 6 to 8 damage at times. On a Geomaglass, I have hit people for 8 damage in tournaments here as well. Like, this just randomly wins you games. It's really, really good. The only sad thing is when you check it on damage, when you need the CB for something like X Gallop, honestly, and like you're like, oh wait, I wanted that CB and it's gone. But it's a really good OT. There's no reason not to run it. It's just very powerful. Now this part might surprise a lot of you, and I hope people in Japan don't watch this too much because they really care, or like they try to play very carefully because they assume that there's a lot of crits on my deck. But this may come off as a surprise. I only play 3 crits, and these are the Stride crits because this is the lowest amount of shield you lose by discarding this for Stride. It's only 15, whereas usually your grade 3s are at least 20. So Stride crits are very important, but I'm just running 3 because stands and heals are much more important. Like, that's just honestly how it is. So 3 crit, 1 OT so far. And then the absolute god that is the Heal Guard. This is searchable with Eternity Chaser in this deck, which is super huge. Don't even need to run Grand Rope in order to find it. You can run Grand Rope though, it's pretty interesting. So it's just a heal guard. Obviously, when you guard with it, if you didn't run a grade 3 yet this game, you can use one of the effects to either give your Vanguard plus 10k for the turn, or give your opponent's attacking unit -2 crit for the battle. And if you call it to rear, you deal yourself a damage if you don't have any damage. That way you can use stuff like Dieliner, or if your opponent didn't give you any CB, you can use Geomaglass, and then intercept with this for 30k, 35k intercept, which is pretty damn good. So yes, it's just an amazing heal guard. I feel like this heal guard is better than any other clans just because of how much it does to Dimension Police. And now you may be surprised, like, oh, I didn't see any Enigman Calm, I didn't see any Grand Monk. And to tell you the truth, I was playing Grand Monk before. But the only real matchups where I felt Grand Monk coming up were like basically Narukami and Kagero occasionally, but especially Narukami because their giving resist to my whole field was pretty huge. But then I felt like Narukami isn't going to come up as much, although it might change now, so you might want to make space for one Grand Monk in the main deck by maybe cutting one of your, like, either a Diarm or a Lage, like the Taser, because I run 4 draw PGs. So at first I was running 2, I think, and I was running 2 main deck Grand Monks, so distributing the PG, you know, kind of like, you know, diversifying it. But now we run 4 draw PGs, and honestly, I'm pretty happy about it. 4 draws is fine. You do deck out when the games get really long in some decks, or you get close to deck out, so you have to like go into a Stark to not die. But draw PGs are nice because, again, this doesn't take up our main deck space because it is very vital. Like, I think Honolulu is way too important to be using that space for PGs right now, because that's like the only place where you could really be cutting cards outside of your grade 3s. So draw PGs are good. They honestly get the job done. And right now, there's just not as much space for main deck PGs in my opinion, or like for like non-trigger PGs. But if you do want to make space, I would cut 1 for a Grand Monk, especially if you have a lot of Narukami in your locals. But honestly, Narukami is a pretty easy matchup for this deck. Like, I'm going to be honest with you. I'll go over that in the matchup section, so look forward to that. Alright, up next, we have the final card that is not the starter, which is of course for Linka's. Linka is still very important, even with the rise of the PG G-Guards. So if you don't know what she does, she says Burst, GB2, you put her to Soul. If your Vanguard is 20k or greater, you draw one, and if it's 35k or greater, you give your Vanguard the following ability. As long as it has the burst ability, that is. Which is Vanguard Circle. When you drive check a grade 3, you can Soul Blast 1, and then choose an opponent's unit on the Guardian Circle that has the cannot be hit ability and nullify it. So if you use 2 of her in one turn, then every time you check grade 3, you can Soul Blast 2 to nullify 2 PGs. And it's, you know, it scales like that. So, people say like, oh, this card should get restricted, she's so unfair, like, oh my god, it's so uninteractive. I mean, I guess I do agree she is pretty uninteractive, but this is honestly one of the most important win con cards for the clan, so I would feel pretty bad about losing her, but it's not the end of the world. I think I prefer instead of banning her, I prefer Bushiroad's approach of printing G-Guards that have PG effects that don't count as PG effects, so like she cannot nullify them. Because basically against those matchups, you would just be more careful how you use her. Like you will simply put only one of them to Soul to kind of like check if your opponent has a heal guard, and you try to keep track of your opponent's drive checks to see if they have any heals in hand. Because against Lord, for example, definitely the G-Guard does make that matchup a bit harder. But against anything else, like you can just like chuck 3 of these, like you can call 3 of these and a Laurel, rest Laurel in the 3 of them to double your Vanguard's power and give them a crit, and then use all 3 of them and just like, blow your opponent up. Because if you use 2 or 3, usually it's like that. Literally, if you use 3, your opponent has to call 4 PGs to not die to a 1 grade 3 check. If you use 2, your opponent has to call 3 PGs for 1 battle to not die to a grade 3 check. And you're attacking with like a 5-6 drive check X Gallop or like a 5-6 drive check Unibird Galaxy. So they really can't risk it. Like this card will just win you games. So it's a very important component, and it was reprinted in English last year, so I hope you have your copies. And finally, of course, we have the starter. We're running B starters, no Goyusha stuff. The extra card you get from the draw is really important, and the Quick Shield is really good because you discard that for Eternity Chaser, and therefore that is just like the optimal, thing to get, so make sure you have your Quick Shields. So that's the main deck. I think my raw footage says we took half an hour to talk about the main deck, and we're only about to get into the G-Zone. So, G-Zone time, let's talk about it. I guess let's go over the best first stride first, and then talk about the second stride options. So of course your first best stride, yes, has not changed, which is of course the Geomaglass. Again, I'm very proud that I revealed a card that is so good. So Geomaglass, of course, has 2 effects, the first one being Vanguard Circle and G-Zone. If it's face up, then your Rearguard Circle and Guardian Circle grade 3s all get plus 5k power, plus 5k shield, and intercept. And of course this stacks. So for every face-up copy, that's another plus 5k. And when it attacks on Vanguard Circle, you can counterblast 1 and flip a G unit face up to look at the top 7 cards of your deck and call 2 of them to Rearguard Circles and shuffle your deck. And then for every grade 3 unit that you have on the field, this gets plus 1 critical. So basically, if you have like 3 grade 3 Rearguards, this gets plus 3 crit, plus the Force 2, which is 4 crit, plus base crit, which is 5. So generally speaking, like I oftentimes just like stride this, go into battle phase, attack, call 2. Like, you just don't need to worry about swinging with rears against many matchups, because this is swinging in with like 4 crit, right? So you don't want to be giving your opponent like chip CB to like be able to use a bunch of their effects. You want to choke them at like 2 or 3 most of the time, and then just go from there. There are some matchups that obviously can operate pretty well without CB, so against things like Regalia, you can just like go ham and like go face. This card is just the most important first stride in my opinion, and the most important card to flip at all times. And I really recommend playing 4 of it because the plus 5k it gives is so instrumental. Like, that intro, like the intro little gag that I did over there, like I only got that much shield because of this card and the new G-Guard. So Geomaglass is really important, and I know that it's very, very expensive. If you can have 3, I think the deck is playable and it's still going to be very good. But honestly, like if you don't have Geomaglass, it's really like the deck gets nerfed a lot. So this card carries the deck, the extra shield, the extra power. Don't forget that the Rearguard Circle power up is on your opponent's turn too. So if they try to swing into your 28k grade 3 with like a 15, just tell them, hey, this is 28k, it doesn't hit. And the tutor effect is really good because you can find Honolys off of this. It's not a grade 3, but it's still good. You can find tasers off of this, so then your opponent starts to go like, ugh. If they play something like Granblue. Like, you can find your Dizauruses, call them to the back. This can find Diar mid-battle phase and get a plus 30k mid-battle phase, so suddenly, like, your opponent will have maybe already guarded something on the rear, or, like, if you swing with this Vanguard first, then, of course, your opponent might still have 10 cards in hand, so just, like call double Diarm and then, like, try to win off of that. Especially against Narukami, which doesn't have a searchable PG, so they basically have to, like, manually guard oftentimes. And especially decks that play crit Sentinels, they get screwed even harder. So yes, enough talking about Geomaglass. This card is amazing. Like, I have so many things to say about this guy, but he's way too good. And now finally, of course, the cover card of this video, the Unibird Galaxy. This is the card I revealed most recently, and he's amazing. That's all I can really tell you. This card is really good, and I've gone over many of the good aspects of this card already in the video that I revealed the card in. And so this little guy says, Vanguard Circle, for every card in your damage zone and your rear guard, this unit gets plus 10k. So if you have 5 damage and 5 rear guards, he gets plus 100k. And then Burst, Vanguard Circle once per turn. When this unit attacks, you can flip its unit face up, aka you will flip Geomaglass. And then if this unit's power is 50k or greater, this unit gets plus 1 crit. And if its power is 100k or greater, then he also gets plus 2 drive. So you mostly go into this card as a damage deny stride, because you just want to like go into it just to flip Geomaglasses at this point. And you usually can hit the crit. Like, if you did get damage denied, you can still call down like 3 cards to have the 58. And then hit OT and get to 100k, which is great. Except it doesn't work like that. It doesn't work like that. But you know, you do get more damage from the OT, which is cool. But anyway, that aside, the card's strengths are that it's a 0 damage play, which is really cool. And like 0 damage play doesn't just mean at 0 damage, right? Because that's what people usually think. At 0 damage, you're usually going to just call down your freaking heal guard, give yourself damage, go into Geomaglass. This is what I mean when you just use up all of your CB and you don't have any more heals left, and you've used your Atlantis Dolphin for the CC and you literally cannot have any more CB this game. But you're on 5 usually in those cases, and that means he already has plus 50, and then he's going to be on 78, which means you commit like 3 rears or just like 2 rears and an 8k boost, and you're breaking the 100k, which means that you're going in with a full effect. Just keep in mind, because it's 5 drives, you can deck out pretty easily because of that. Because again, you're drive checking a lot with this, you're calling stuff from deck, you're drive checking with Excalibur and all that kind of stuff. So that's the only thing to really be careful of. And honestly, because of how big the power on this thing is, and you can use Linka with it to give it the PG break skill, you will oftentimes just win the game because your opponent does not have PGs, or if they do have, they don't have enough, and you're going to just check rate 3s and win off of that. So Unibird Galaxy is just a fantastic card. Like, I don't know, like I literally, it's a really good card. I run only 2 copies of it because usually just go into it, flip Geomaglass off of it, and then you only really need to go into it again when you're at the end of the game or as your second stride, for example. So like, you know, you go into Geomaglass first, and then you go into this to like pressure them from 3 because you have the crit from this and the force 2 that then tries to pressure them from game. So yeah, it's a really amazing card. I feel like there's just so many things you can talk about with it, and it's like it's a very good like damage denial play / late game play when you're out of CB. Then we are playing 2 copies of Excalibur. You know, this card has been around forever at this point. Unfortunately, in Japanese, this is the highest rarity that this card has ever been available in, which is GR. It's never been reprinted, even though in English it has 2 printings. No, 3 printings, 3. So Excalibur, it says a once per turn burst, counterblast 1 when it attacks, and flip each unit face up. If his power is 40k or greater, you can pay that cost, and then if you did, he gets plus 1 drive, and then at the end of the battle, if his power is 80k or greater, you stand him and he loses 4 drives. And then his GB3 says for every face-up card in your G-Zone, he gets plus 10k. So if you stride him, so let's say you first stride Geomaglass, and then you go into this, and then he will have his GB3 immediately getting plus 20k, then you attack, flip another one, get another 10k. And of course, you can use Dizoris to fill up that power to get to the 80k. Like, reaching these thresholds isn't that hard. Like, Laurel will do it for you usually. On first stride, if you're at 28 and you use the Laurel, that'll put you to 56. And then if you have literally any form of boost, like even the Linka, you will get put to 60. And then it's just a matter of like another 20k. So like a Dizoris will get you another 10, and then you can still put triggers on him mid-battle from the first attack to push to 80k as well. But generally speaking, like if your opponent gave you a lot of CB and you're going into this first stride, either you have a lot of CB to use on like Dizoris and Laurel, or you G-guarded on your after riding up, because that's another thing you can do is like you ride up, you G-guard, and then you set up the GB3 already for your first stride. So that's also really big. That's one of the reasons why we ride up, is that we can first stride Excalibur because we G-guard into it. So that way you usually are sitting on like 48, and then one Laurel will get to 96, and then on attack you'll go to 106, and then every Dizoris adds another 10, so it's like 116 or stuff like that that you get to. And resending Vanguard with 3 crit is pretty scary when it's hitting for that much power. So this is one of our best win cons. It's our first stride, but it's also our win con. Again, it drive checks a lot, which is part of the weakness, is that you can deck out with this, and we don't have cards that like recycle back the deck, so you have to be careful. But 2 copies of Excalibur is just enough. Like, you only go into it in first stride and when you're trying to win the game. And oftentimes your first stride can be Geomaglass instead, so this will be like your second and third, or your third and fourth, depending on how long the game is going on for. Then our other strides, we have 1 copy of Stark. This is actually a very important Xerath Dragon, because when you're getting close to deck out, you need to go into the Stark. So He says when you place him on Vanguard Circle, of course, in the ultimate stride, you have to discard a copy of your Vanguard for this. So sometimes you have to ride Die Arm and discard a Die Arm and stuff like that. But when you do stride it, you counterblast 2 and then get the following ability. For this turn, when this unit attacks, it does not rest, and it loses 2 drives for the turn, but attacks 3 times this turn. So you go boom, 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 like this. It's like a Yu-Gi-Oh card, right? It attacks like this. And of course, when you use Dizoris, he gets +1 drive, so that stays for the whole turn, so it attacks with 2 drive, 2 drive, 2 drive. You can double its power and give an extra crit with Laurel too. Like, I've explained this, I feel like this aspect of the deck many times now. But now the new development for me is that this is a good stride to go into when you're about to deck out. So if you're playing in something that can prolong the game, like honestly Ghidorah can definitely prolong the game quite well, like you will just be going into like, you know, all of your other strides flip, so you can actually, you know, get to this pretty easily. It's not a GBA, you just need 3 cards to face up in the G-Zone. So you will get to it, and you will be able to use this effect. Just keep in mind the CB requirement. And if you don't want to, you know, you don't want to run out of CB, then you have to go into Unibird more often. So yeah, that's Stark. Stark has always been very good. This is the one slot where you can really put more or less anything. Dimax DX is one of the cards that I was considering in here, but I needed something that can win me the game when I'm on 5 and my opponent's on 5, and I'm close to deck out, so I only want to drive check 3 cards. So I'm still running the GB8 here. The GB8 says when it attacks the Vanguard, for each of your rear guards, it gets plus 10k in a crit. And at the end of the battle, if its power is 80k or greater, then for every crit this unit has, you give all of your rear guards plus the 10k. So usually speaking, like your opponent's already used up a lot of PGs throughout the game, and this is just a surefire way to win, because he gets to 80k just by having a full field, and he will get plus 5 crit, plus his base crit, plus the force 2. So he has 7 crit, so at the end of the battle he gives plus 70k to all of your rears. So he's swinging with like 140 something K on the remaining 2 columns. And like, if they don't have PGs and they're on 5, like this will just win you the game. So again, when your deck size is getting low, this is a pretty good option to go into in the late game. Against Ghidorah, you almost never go into this because you never have this much face up in the G zone because you can't G guard. But against anything else, it does actually work out. So that's why I dedicated 1 slot to the GB8. And now finally we have the G guards, and we are going to go through the first new G guard first. And we're playing 3 copies of Giragamelgos because this card is basically carrying this clan. So Giragamelgos says, when placed on Guardian Circle, you Soul Blast 1, and then you choose 2 grade 3 normal units in your drop zone and add them back to your hand. And for every card added to your hand, it gets plus 5k shield. Using 3 Giragamelgos is how I got to the short in the start of the video, because this is basically 25k per card, so that's 75k shield. And then if you have 4 face-up Geomagluses, that's 20k shield, the Dieliner is 10k shield, so you have 30k shield in hand that you just keep going through, and so Giragamelgos is the only way to do that. Of course, he requires Soul, and so I've cut one of the other G-Guards that uses up Soul because that is Geo5, because Geo5 just never really came up for me ever since I started playing this card. I was initially playing 2 copies and 1 Geo5, but ever since I just was like, wait, what do I never used Geo5, because this is 25k shield, but it gets me back huge shields. It gets you back your Zeroth Dragon discard fodder, it gets you back your Die Arms that you intercepted away, it gets you back your Tasers that Granblue got rid of, it gets you back Dizorises that are in your soul, so you can Soul Blast the Dizorises that you put in and then get them back and use them again next turn. Sadly, the only thing is that because it's a G-Guard, it doesn't come up much against Ghidorah, because Ghidorah stops you from G-Guarding, so that's the only thing you have to be very careful of and like manage your grade 3s very carefully. Against any other deck, you can be very haphazard with your grade 3s and just like put them out like for like buffing up Geomaglas, guard with them aggressively just to get them back to hand, because this basically just makes them infinite. Well, almost infinite. But against Ghidorah, sadly, like be careful, like you need extra Dieliners to rewrite and stuff like that. So yeah, this card is just a dream come true, honestly. There's no better G-Guard in the clan. Still running 1 copy of Atlantis Dolphin. This card says that when your Vanguard is, when your opponent's Vanguard is attacking and this card is placed on the Guardian Circle, then you can flip a G-Unit face up, and then for every one of your reguards, he gets plus 5k shield, and if he has 30k shield or more, you countercharge 1, soul charge 1. So nowadays we actually have more of a field than before, because nowadays we always have a Hunley in the back, and then you oftentimes like you go into Geomaglas and you call stuff to the back row because you don't want your opponent to damage deny you. So then you typically have 3 things in the back row, so you can actually have the 30k shield on this pretty consistently, and then you get yourself the countercharge soul charge. Now both resources are very important, because the countercharge, of course, I mean, we count for virtually everything in this deck outside of Unibird, and the soul charge is necessary for the previous G-Guard because he needs to Soul Blast. So very, very important. This gets a soul, as well as Linka gets a soul, so they're all very important. Dizoris gets a soul, so soul is also very important now in the deck too. So 1 Atlantis Dolphin is enough because his timing is very tight, and it's mainly just the timing. The timing is pretty tough. And then we play 1 copy of the Zeal G-Guard. This is also very good against Nightmare Dolls because the plus 5k means their like 17 or 27k Alice that is on the Axel Circle does not hit, because this guy says when you guard with it, you can soul blast 1 and then give the attacking unit minus 5k, and if you have the same or more damage than your opponent, you can counter blast 1 and give your Vanguard plus 5k for the turn. So this means that the Alices that are restanding, or like the Leslies that are restanding, are easier to guard because you're a force deck, so you go to 18, or if you check defensive, you go to 28. This makes guarding against Axel decks much easier. I would say the same for protect decks, but honestly just Grand Blue and Gridora come up to mind. And against Gridora, you can't use this, and against Grand Blue, they attack with Skull Dragon, which is attacking for a crazy amount of power. So this is mainly for Nightmare Dolls, but it's a good card against Nightmare Dolls, so that's it. And then I mentioned it quite a few times already today, but Dismal is important for the Nightmare Doll matchup because it protects our Tasers as well as protecting our Dear Honolly, and so therefore this card is super, super important. And that is it. It only took me 50 minutes to get through the deck, and I'm still going to talk about matchups. So strap in, you're here for the whole lecture. So first, before we talk matchups, there are a couple cards that you probably noticed I've cut. So the first one of which is basically Grand Wisdom. So this is one of our CC options. And I basically cut it because we realized in testing with Derek that committing that attack for the CC oftentimes just gave my opponent the damage that they needed in order to get something done. And the CC timing was quite awkward in that it's always at the end of the turn. So you don't get that kind of for the turn, so you have to always kind of like think ahead. Instead, you can use the Enigma Grade 1 that can also get you the CC during the main phase. Or I mean like during your actual turn during the battles. So that is one of the cards that we cut, so we went down to 8 grade 2s because of that. And then Drawhead is a very cool card that you can run because Drawhead allows you to stop boosts for the rest of the turn, and this is really big against Regalia, so if you have a lot of Regalia in your meta, this will be very big because it turns off Norn completely. Whereas now our only tool against Norn is Taser, because she can rest the Norn when she gets called out of the Yggdrasil. So those are, I think, the two main cards that I've cut on top of like Dimex DX, but that's basically I cut it because I don't want to deck out even more than already having to, and we have a better first stride option for 0 damage plays as well. Alright, let's talk matchups. I'm finally home. Gonna keep it brief as this video has already been very, very long, so don't want to let it drag on too much. For Nightmare Dolls, I think you're overall favored simply because you have Taser plus the Dismal that can stop their Nightmare Dolls. With Nightmare Dolls, I typically like to keep them at 3, and then from there you have a bunch of lethal points that you can take with your strides. So overall, I would say choke them at 3, but make sure you do have them at 3 by your first stride. So whether that is attacking more on like a grade 2 turn, or whether that is just trying to bait out heal guards and stuff with a die liner, just do what you need to do to get them there. And of course, if you don't have like Taser plus Dismal, giving them first strike is going to hurt a lot. That being said, you're a very defensive deck. You can of course tank a lot of hits, and especially be careful with Dust because they do have access to CC with the Chimera. So always like keep note of like the Chimera, keep count of like Abigail, and like that's why I say keep them at 3, because if you give them more, even if they have like face down CB, they can still flip it face up and do like pretty nasty dust combos on you. Order Colony, in my opinion, it's pretty tough because the only thing in the whole deck that calls from non-hand is actually the Geomaglas. So you want to be able to take first stride if possible, but technically speaking, because they run the Girafa grade 2, they can grade 2 game you. So if you get first stride, go for Geomaglas. If you don't, you generally speaking go for like Unibird and flip Geomaglases, or Excalib first stride and flip Geomaglases, but otherwise Geomaglas will not do anything. Like you're gonna just attack with it to flip it and then like, you know, get some crit maybe. So that kind of hurts, and of course the fact that your G-Guards are turned off means they have to be very careful of your die liners in hand. So always keep them to re-ride, like you won't be able to recycle as much shield, but the strong thing about the Order Colony matchup is that they do not have a searchable PG, so they have to draw into it with, of course, you know, they have a lot of draw power thanks to the book, but if they don't draw into it, you generally just win because you have such high power. But of course, again, Gridora is a pretty tough card to play against, so do keep that in mind. Luckily for you, Unibird Galaxy also, because it gets so many drive checks, you generally speaking go through more cards in your deck, so you find more grade 3s to re-ride, which is very important. Another play you can do is for your first ride to ride something that isn't die liner, so like a Diarm or a Dizaurus, and then re-ride into die liner when you actually have more shield available with the Geomaglas, because technically speaking, if you don't have any Geomaglases face up, you don't really use the grade 3 shield as much, so you can choose to kind of like bait out that kind of like dud grade 3 for one turn as well. With Regalia, so if you want to make this matchup easier for you, if you have a lot of them in your locals, you want to play Drawhead because it stops their units from boosting. That way, like, you have a huge edge in this matchup because it stops Norn, but they can still like first swing with Vanguard and then like still make use of the Norn. But otherwise, like, Minerva is going to be a big problem. Like, the Minerva strike turn is really scary. Marduk is also quite scary, and generally speaking, like, good Regalia players can be a really big issue for this deck, or like for this matchup in general. And generally speaking, especially if you're going first, you can kind of like push damage quite a bit because you don't have to worry about Marduk coming out. It's like if they go first, like you really don't want to give them too much CP because of Marduk. But again, you do have your Taser combo to at least stop Yggdrasil calling out a Norn. You can rest it that way. But I mean, if they just manually call it, then you're in a bit of a tough spot. So this matchup I think isn't actually as good for you compared to some of the others, but I also don't think that Regalia is as popular as the other decks you mentioned. So we'll see how things change going into the new format. For Grand Blue, this can be pretty tough as well. Like, you do have Tasers that can stop Skull Dragons and or Night Mists coming in, or Night Storms rather, but they can use their, Skeleton Cannoneer to kill your Tasers. So if you have two, of course, that will stop something. Generally speaking, it's knowing when to use the Taser that'll make the difference. Like on the first Obadiah turn, what you rest is very important because, if they have a Jesse in the drop zone, you're pretty much sure that whatever you rest is going to get traded off for the Jesse. But generally speaking, you can also grind the game out pretty well against Grand Blue because they need their first strike turn to be a setup turn with Big Obadiah, whereas all of your turns are like asking for lethal points. Like you're always asking for game. So keep that in mind and try to control the tempo of that matchup, because once they get to the big Night Storm combo, it really does get very scary. So then you're basically just reliant on your face of Geomagluses and using your Giragamel Ghost to have as much shield as possible to survive and clap back. So always track their drop zone and the PGs in the drop zone and stuff like that. I think that's really important. There's a lot of really good Grand Blue players here in Japan, so I've honestly played this matchup quite a lot. And they also don't have to necessarily go Skull Dragon spam. Sometimes they just do Beatrice spam with Night Storm, and that can be more annoying because those are smaller attacks, so you're wasting shield with all of your grade 3 guarding. So do keep that in mind. That's another case where Attorney Chaser can be pretty big too. Bermuda's a matchup that I really haven't tested as much. Bermuda's going to be quite popular now going forward, so I really want to get more testing done. But there's a lot of different variants, and whether it's Highlander or Prisms that have been popping up too. Since they, Taser can put in some work, but otherwise you basically just have to work with your game plan. But this is really a matchup I haven't tested too much, so I can't really say as much. But if you guys do have experience with Bermuda, then feel free to put that in there. Stunverse, Vanquisher Eradicators, honestly, I kind of put them under the same bracket. You can play around Stunverse pretty well. Exterminate is still pretty scary, but from my experience so far playing against Narukami, it's you can bait their Stunverses a bit by just giving them very little. Because generally speaking, you don't guard early as much unless they try to aggro you. So if you don't guard early, you don't have much drop zone, so that way you're not giving them much from the drop into the bind zone of the first Stunverse, and if you play just a couple things on the rears, then you also don't give them that much either. So their first strike Stunverse will always not give them that much, so they typically will go for Exterminate, and then it just depends on what kind of parts they have in hand. If they have multiple Chos / Valientes that can be Espiral Ideas that can be restood with that plus 20-30k power that they get on it, then sure, that's going to be quite scary, especially if you gave them first strike, because then, of course, you don't have as much defensive power yet. But honestly, Stunverse as a card isn't as scary. It's more so the multi-attack that they can do with Exterminate, as well as Cho-O / Espiral Idea. So I would say try to bait Stunverses, but keep your drop zone low for the first stride. So you can still put stuff down on the field to make them do a Stunverse, because obviously, if you have a front row for when they do a first stride, if they go into Exterminate, they're not going to get the draw off, so they're going to want to Stunverse you, and then they don't get much out of the Stunverse because you're giving them 3 cards or something from field and drop combined. And even if you give them 4, okay, losing a card from hand isn't as bad. And the thing with Narukami is that they don't have a way to search PGs. I guess they have the Eradicator PG that they can search, but that's the only one and it's not really consistent. So any deck that doesn't have searchable PGs automatically has a worse time against you because they have to draw into them. And Vanquisher, for example, does draw a fair bit, but again, if you give them a bad Stunverse first stride, they're not going to have as many cards. And if you don't give them a good Exterminate, with the draw skill, then they're not going to have a good Exterminate turn either, they're not going to have a great hand. So you kind of have an edge in that matchup too, simply because of that. And then finally, I guess I'll talk about Luard a bit, because that's definitely going to be popping up a bit. The G-Guard makes Luard pretty hard to play against, because if you've been tracking their heal guards and you know that they have the G-Guard available to just PG something out, you're gonna basically just have because you typically, every stride is trying to go for lethal and you have to invest some resources like Dizorus's to achieve that. And so if you invest resources like Linkas and Dizorus's in order to get shut down by the heal guard, the G-Guard, it's gonna feel pretty bad. So just be careful to not overcommit on your Linkas, not overcommit over your Dizorus's, or just your resources in general, in case you know that they have the G-Guard and they have the resources in the drop zone to activate the PG effect of the G-Guard. Because as long as you can kind of control your resources and keep track of that, it will be okay. And generally speaking with Luard, you can kind of you have to play very carefully on the damage game, because you honestly speaking, can only afford to give them like 1 CB, and I would not give it for the turn 2. Like, you don't want them just Leah falling you. Some of them play the Blaster Dark engine, of course, so that's honestly not too bad because you can just, you know, drop some shield to make it a 2 to pass. But giving them 1 CB usually means that they can recycle that 1 CB to like literally get Ritual 10 on a Morfessa first stride, and then like, you know, potentially kill you with that. Like, I died to Musarx's Luard like that in BSF. So like, don't give them damage for the turn 2 because they will grade 2 game you as well, and Leafall will just set up their drop zone even better too. Generally speaking, the one edge you have is that if you do give them the 1 damage for their first stride Morfessa, you can sort of keep them on 1 thanks to Geomaglass. So try to utilize Geomaglass to just like keep them on 1 and just like swing Geomaglass pass until you've restricted some of the resources, until you're ready to go for more lethal play, or your hand is really good to tank some defenses. So yeah, like Luard is honestly a pretty hard matchup because also Morfessa makes things pretty hard. Like Morfessa's like guard with 2 cards at once is pretty rough because like generally speaking, want to guard with 1 card because our grade 3s are huge. So that is kind of hard, and you definitely need to be aware of that. And then the one matchup that I think is very cursed for DP is DI. If you play against DI, just be ready for Hope on Damp. Like, you're basically on a timer. By the time they have Hope on Damp, you're dead. Because Hope on Damp asks for original 20 shield, which you do not have original shield on your grade 3s, even when there's extra shield effects. So you're naturally just dead to Hope on Damp. They have resist G-guards that, of course, cannot be killed. Or like, the resist G-guard gives resist to your other stuff, I believe. So it's like, DI is a rough matchup. And honestly, I don't run into much of it, so I'm very thankful. But if you have locals with DI players in Premium and you're a DP player, you are going to have a tough time. So yeah, those are like the main matchups I want to talk about. Obviously, there's much more, and there's also a lot of things coming out of Premium Collection that we can talk about too. But for the time being, I think that's like the main sort of ones that come up a lot. So hopefully that was useful to fellow players. So with that, that is it for this Dimension Police deck thesis dissertation, because of course, it's a lot longer than expected, but of course I wanted to really go into detail and talk about everything possible about this deck because I love it so much, and it's really just my favorite deck to play. So I hope this was helpful. If you liked it, please do give a like to this video because I know that you enjoy these kind of things, especially when I go into the nitty-gritty of these decks that I really love. Also, if you haven't already, please do subscribe, really appreciate it. And if you want to buy your own cards for this deck, you can head over to parkage.com and use my discount code PKDifferent for a 5% discount at checkout. But anyway guys, that's it for me today. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye bye.